The steel cable went taut, vibrating with a high-pitched hum that cut through the heavy, stagnant air of the Lake Conway Nature Preserve. It was July 17, 1999, and the Florida sun was a physical weight, pressing down on the necks of the recovery crew. The swamp didn't want to give up its secrets. The water here is thick and black, a stagnant soup of decaying vegetation and ancient mud. Every time the winch turned, the mud groaned, a wet sucking sound that felt like the earth itself was protesting. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and rot. It's a smell that sticks to your clothes and crawls into your lungs. The workers wiped sweat from their eyes, their boots sinking into the muck as the rear bumper of a 1997 green Ford Explorer finally broke the surface. It didn't look like a car anymore. It looked like a drowned beast, draped in long, weeping strands of algae and coated in a layer of gray slime. There was no dignity in this exit. The metal scraped against the limestone rocks of the service road, a jarring, screeching noise that echoed through the silent palmetto brush. This wasn't just a recovery mission. It was the moment a neighborhood's hope was dragged into the dirt and executed. Everyone watching felt the same tightening in their chest. The Thompsons had been missing for 3 days, and as the water cascaded off the roof of the vehicle in heavy rhythmic splashes, the reality began to set in. This wasn't an accident. No one drives this deep into the preserve by mistake. The vehicle was positioned at an angle that suggested intent. It had been guided down an isolated service road, hidden from the main path by a wall of thick brush. The person behind the wheel knew exactly where the water was deep enough to swallow a life whole. As the truck pulled the Explorer onto solid ground, the suspension hissed under the weight of the water trapped inside. It was a heavy, hollow sound, a sound of finality. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. As the Ford Explorer sat dripping on the gravel, the recovery crew stepped back. They weren't looking at the mud or the weeds anymore. They were looking at the windows. The glass was coated in a thick, translucent layer of green algae that acted like a frosted veil. It obscured the interior, turning the cabin into a murky underwater tomb. Detective Marcus Rivera stepped forward, his shoes crunching on the dry brush. He didn't wait for the water to stop draining. He took his gloved hand and wiped a clean streak across the driver's side window. The movement was small, but the result was a violent jolt to the senses. Behind that smear of wet glass, a face was pressed close. It was John Thompson. His skin was the color of wet parchment, his eyes wide and fixed on a point somewhere beyond the dashboard. He looked startled, as if the moment of his death had been frozen in a state of eternal surprise. Beside him, slumped toward the center console, was Vickie. Her signature bright hair was matted and dark, swirling around her shoulders like seaweed. The silence that followed was heavy. No birds chirped. The wind seemed to die in the trees. The crew realized they weren't just looking at a car wreck. They were looking at a display. The vehicle hadn't just rolled into the lake. It had been positioned. The seats were upright. The seat belts were still buckled. It was a terrifyingly domestic scene, preserved in 8 feet of stagnant water. The water inside the cabin was still slowly leaking out of the door seals, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that cut through the swampy rot. It was the smell of old blood mixed with lake salt. Rivera signaled for the door to be forced. When the seal finally broke, the sound was like a heavy gasp, the last bit of trapped air escaping the tomb. The smell hit everyone instantly. It was a physical blow, a mixture of decomposition and the sharp chemical scent of gunpowder that had lingered in the upholstery. They didn't find a struggle inside. They found a nightmare of clinical precision. John and Vickie hadn't died from drowning. As the investigators cleared the glass shards and mud, the truth became visible on the back of their heads. 2 small, neat entry wounds, one for John, one for Vickie. Both had been shot at point-blank range from behind. The bullets, .38 caliber rounds, had done their work with horrific efficiency. There was no glass spray from the outside, no signs of a shootout. This was a controlled slaughter. The most agonizing part was the positioning of their hands. John's wrists showed deep purple furrows, ligature marks. He had been bound with rope, held tight while he was forced to sit in his own car, knowing what was coming. The rope was gone, but the damage was permanent. Vickie's hands told an even more painful story. Her fingernails were broken, and there were deep scratches on the backs of her forearms. She had fought. She had clawed at the air, at the seat, at the person holding the gun, desperate to save the man she loved, or to simply keep her heart beating for one more second. The killer had watched them die. He had sat in that back seat, felt the heat of the muzzle flash, and watched as the light left their eyes. Then he had stepped out, wiped his prints, and sent the car rolling into the depths. He didn't just kill them, he tried to erase them. He wanted the swamp to digest the evidence of his cruelty, but the swamp had failed him. Now their bodies were back on land, testifying to a level of calculated rage that Orlando had never seen. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution by someone who knew exactly how to make a human being feel utterly powerless. Their lives were not meant to end like this. Not John Thompson, the man who waved at every neighbor, whose weekends were filled with mending fences and coaching Little League teams, pouring his energy into children who weren't even his own. He was the anchor of the Thornhill Lake subdivision, a quiet force of decency. And Vickie Thompson, his wife, was the vibrant heart of it all. Her small catering business, built from their home, filled Orange County with the scent of her famous key lime pies and the echo of her infectious laugh. You could hear it from 3 houses away, a sound of pure joy. They were the couple you wanted at your barbecue, the kind that transformed a mere collection of houses into a family.
Now their bodies lay under plastic sheets on the hot Florida dirt, and all of that, the laughter, the pies, the tireless kindness, was reduced to cold flesh and bullet wounds. They were planning to expand Vickie's business, dreaming of a new commercial space, a future filled with the sweet taste of success. They had promised Tracy, Vickie's business partner, they'd be back by sunset that Wednesday. Sunset came and went, then darkness, then 3 days of agonizing fear. The killer didn't just take their lives, they stole decades of potential, erased a future that was almost within reach. The grief that would soon descend on their family and friends would be a cold, unrelenting monster, far worse than any Florida summer heat. It was a grief born of betrayal, of a future violently snatched away. Ask yourself this. Have you ever had a neighbor who seemed too good to be true? The one who always helped, always smiled, always felt like family? What if someone like that, someone so connected to their community, simply vanished? Has something like this happened in your town, where the most beloved residents are targeted not by random chance, but by cold, calculated malice? The problem is, we often believe that evil wears a mask we can recognize, that danger announces itself. But in this story, the threat was invisible. It moved among them, knew their routines, exploited their trust. It waited for the perfect moment to strike, then vanished like a ghost. This case went cold for 23 years, baffling police and shattering a community. But the truth, however long it sleeps, eventually wakes up. The solution lies in a microscopic detail, a technological breakthrough, and a shocking revelation that would turn a community's understanding of safety upside down. This is the story of how John and Vickie Thompson's killer thought he'd gotten away with the perfect crime, only to be caught by a thread so small it almost went unnoticed. July 14, 1999 started like every other Wednesday in the Thornhill Lake subdivision. The air was a thick, humid blanket that trapped the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant salt of the coast. For John and Vickie Thompson, life was a series of well-worn, happy rhythms. John spent his morning doing exactly what he always did, checking the oil in the Ford Explorer and ensuring the neighborhood kids had a safe place to play. He was a man of order. He believed that if you took care of your tools and your people, the world would take care of you. Vickie was already in the kitchen by 6 a.m., the oven radiating a heat that rivaled the Florida sun. Her catering business was finally catching fire, fueled by word of mouth and the kind of work ethic that didn't allow for shortcuts. They were the golden couple of the block, the ones who made everyone else feel like they belonged. They weren't just living, they were building a legacy of kindness. They had no idea that this would be the last morning they would ever share a cup of coffee on their patio. They had no idea that every wave to a neighbor and every promise made that day was being marked by a clock they couldn't see. The evening was supposed to be a celebration of their growth, a quick trip to see a new commercial property that would take Vickie's business to the next level. They left the house with smiles on their faces, dressed for a professional meeting, convinced they would be back before the streetlights hummed to life. The neighborhood watched them drive away, a green speck disappearing into the orange glow of the sunset, unaware that the house they left behind was about to become a monument to a crime that would stay frozen in time for over 2 decades. Tracy Mendoza sat on the edge of the Thompsons' floral sofa, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock growing louder with every passing minute. It was 8:30 p.m. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the living room bathed in the blue, artificial glow of the street lamps filtering through the blinds. She had been waiting for over an hour, her notes for the upcoming wedding catering job spread out on the coffee table. Vickie was never late. In the high-stakes world of catering, time was the most valuable ingredient, and Vickie treated it with a reverence that bordered on obsession. Tracy checked her watch again, the leather band feeling tight against her wrist. She tried calling Vickie's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail, a cold digital rejection that made her stomach turn. The house felt heavy. There is a specific kind of silence that occupies a home when the people who belong there are missing. It isn't a peaceful quiet, it is a pressurized, expectant stillness that hums with anxiety. Tracy stood up and walked toward the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She expected to hear the familiar rumble of the Ford Explorer pulling into the driveway at any second, the sound of car doors slamming and Vickie's breathless apologies for the delay. But the driveway remained empty. The neighborhood outside was settling into its nighttime routine, oblivious to the fact that the heart of Thornhill Lakes was no longer beating. Tracy looked at the phone on the wall, debating whether to call the hospitals or the police. She felt like an intruder in a space that was usually so welcoming. Every shadow in the corner of the room seemed to stretch toward her, mocking her hope. The air in the house was cooling as the air conditioning kicked in, but Tracy felt a heat rising in her chest, a frantic, panicked energy that told her the woman she called her partner was never coming through that door. Tracy eventually walked toward the back of the house, drawn by a draft of warm, humid air that shouldn't have been there. When she reached the door leading to the garage, she stopped dead. The large bay door was wide open, exposing the empty concrete floor to the darkness of the street. To anyone else, this might have looked like a simple oversight, but to anyone who knew John Thompson, it was a siren. John was a man governed by a strict internal code of security. He checked the garage door 3 times every night before bed. He never left his tools out, and he certainly never left his home wide open to the night. Seeing that gaping hole in the side of the house felt like seeing a wound. It was a total breach of character, a physical manifestation of a struggle or a hurried departure that John would never have authorized.
The shadows from the streetlights danced on the empty floor where the Ford Explorer should have been parked. There were no oil leaks, no tire scuffs, just a terrifying emptiness. Tracy stood in the doorway, the heat of the Florida night rushing in to meet the cold air of the kitchen, creating a turbulent swirl that made the curtains flutter like ghosts. She called out their names one last time, her voice cracking as it echoed off the metal cabinets and the pegboards where John's tools hung in perfect alignment. There was no answer, only the hum of a nearby transformer and the distant bark of a dog. The open door wasn't just a mistake, it was a scream. It was the first piece of evidence that the order John had spent his life maintaining had been violently dismantled by someone who didn't care about his rules. She retreated back into the kitchen, her eyes darting across the counters, looking for a note or a sign of where they had gone. What she found was far worse than an empty room. On the kitchen counter, 2 dinner plates sat side by side, neatly wrapped in plastic. They were ready for a late meal, a quiet moment the couple intended to share after their business meeting. Vickie's purse was sitting right there on the dining table, her car keys and lipstick tucked inside. In the bedroom, John's wallet lay on the nightstand, containing his identification and the cash he always kept on hand for emergencies. They had left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the vehicle they were driving. People don't go to business meetings without their identification. They don't leave their purses behind if they plan on being gone for more than a few minutes. The house was a snapshot of a life that had been cut off in mid-sentence. It was as if a hand had reached into the room and simply plucked them out of existence while the dinner was still fresh. Every object in the house now felt like a taunt. The half-empty glass of water on the side table, the television remote sitting on the arm of the chair, and the menu plans Tracy had come to discuss, all of it pointed to a total lack of preparation for a disappearance. There was no luggage packed, no drawers ruffled, no signs of a robbery. This wasn't a flight, it was a kidnapping of the soul. The Thompsons hadn't left their lives had been stolen from them while they were still using them. Tracy picked up the wall phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the sheriff's office. She knew with a certainty that chilled her blood that she wasn't just reporting a missing couple, she was announcing the end of the world as Thornhill Lakes knew it. Detective Marcus Rivera pulled his cruiser to the curb of the Thompson residence just as the clock struck midnight. The blue and red lights did not flash. He didn't want to alert a neighborhood that was already on edge. But the air around the house was already vibrating with a static energy. As he stepped onto the driveway, the humid Florida night felt like a physical barrier. He had spent 15 years in the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and he had developed a sixth sense for the difference between a runaway case and a tragedy. The Thompson house didn't feel like a crime scene yet, but it felt like a void. Rivera walked through the open garage door, his eyes scanning the concrete for any signs of fluid leaks or scuff marks that would indicate a struggle or a forced exit. There was nothing. The empty space where the green Ford Explorer usually sat was clean, almost too clean. It was the lack of evidence that began to tighten the knot in his chest. He entered the kitchen through the interior door, nodding to the patrol officers who were already documenting the perimeter. He didn't look at the walls or the furniture first. He looked at the small things. He looked at the way the light caught the edge of a half-empty glass of water. He looked at the mail sitting on the counter, unopened and waiting for a hand that might never return. To Rivera, a house was a living record of its inhabitants' intentions. In this house, the record had been cut off in the middle of a sentence. Every professional instinct he possessed told him that the people who lived here had not walked away by choice. They had been extracted, pulled out of their reality with a surgical precision that left the rest of the world undisturbed. Rivera moved into the dining area, where the silence seemed to grow even heavier. On the table lay Vickie's purse, a simple leather bag that held the entire contents of a woman's daily life. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves, the snap of the rubber echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside the purse, everything was exactly where it should be. Her wallet was full of cash, her credit cards were untouched, her keys were still attached to a brass ring. A person planning to disappear takes their money. A person being robbed loses their wallet. But a person who is simply gone leaves these things behind as if they are no longer relevant. He moved to the kitchen counter where the 2 plates sat, still tightly wrapped in plastic. The sight of that food was more disturbing to him than a blood stain would have been. It represented a plan. It represented the expectation of a tomorrow that had been canceled without notice. The Thompsons had fully intended to come home, sit in those chairs, and eat that meal while discussing their day. The plastic wrap was still taut, protecting the food from a house that was now cold and empty. Rivera leaned over the counter, his face inches from the plates, looking for any sign of a struggle, a spilled glass, a knocked-over chair, a frantic scuff on the linoleum. There was nothing but the haunting order of a well-kept home. This wasn't the work of a panicked amateur or a common thief. This was the work of someone who understood that the most effective way to eliminate a target is to do it so quietly that the world doesn't even realize they are gone until it's far too late. The detective walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He found John's wallet sitting on the dresser next to a pair of glasses and a watch. It was a display of total vulnerability. John Thompson was a man who lived by his routine, a man who never left his house without his identification or his sense of responsibility.
Leaving his wallet behind was equivalent to leaving his identity. Rivera opened the closet doors, noting that no clothes were missing and no suitcases had been moved. The beds were made with military precision, the pillows fluffed and waiting. There was no sign of an intruder, no broken glass at the windows, and no forced entry at the locks. This was the psychological horror of the case. The Thompsons had essentially vanished into thin air from the safety of their own driveway. They had been plucked mid-thought, perhaps while they were buckling their seatbelts or checking the rear-view mirror. The killer hadn't needed to break into the house because the killer had intercepted them at the one moment they felt most secure, the moment they were leaving for a routine errand. Rivera felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He realized he wasn't looking for a typical criminal. He was looking for someone who knew the Thompsons' schedule well enough to know exactly when they would be in that Ford Explorer, ready to drive into a trap. The lack of chaos in the house was a testament to the killer's control. It was a terrifying reminder that our lives are often held together by nothing more than the thin thread of our daily habits. And if someone knows where to cut that thread, everything we've built can fall away in an instant. By the time Rivera walked back out to the driveway, the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, sickly light over the neighborhood. He looked at the other houses on the street, all of them identical, all of them filled with people who believed they were safe because their doors were locked. But the Thompsons' doors had been locked too. Their garage was the only opening, a mechanical failure of security that had turned into a tomb. If John and Vickie could be taken from a place this peaceful, then no one was truly out of reach. It is a thought that should keep you awake at night. We all believe our homes are fortresses, that our routines protect us from the darkness of the world. But for the Thompsons, their routine was the very thing that betrayed them. Imagine the terror of realizing in a split second that the life you worked so hard to build is being taken away, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. If you're not subscribing to this channel, you're missing the very stories that teach you how to see the shadows before they move. Only those who stay alert get to see the full picture. Don't be the one left wondering what you missed while the world was still quiet. If you're still not subscribing, tell us in the comments what's keeping you on the outside. Rivera knew that the clock was ticking. In a missing persons case, the first 48 hours are everything, and they had already lost nearly 12 of them. He climbed into his car and stared at the empty Thompson house one last time. He didn't know then that it would take 23 years to find the answers, but he knew that the silence in that kitchen was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The heavy stainless steel doors of the Orange County Medical Examiner's office swung open with a dull thud, admitting Detective Rivera into a world of fluorescent glare and sterile silence. Here, the humid Florida air was replaced by a biting chemical chill that felt like a slap to the face.
On two separate tables, the bodies of John and Vickie Thompson lay waiting, their journey from the swamp finally ending under the harsh scrutiny of the forensic labs. The autopsy is a brutal process of deconstruction, where a person's final moments are read like a map. The medical examiner, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, didn't need to speak to convey the gravity of what he was seeing. He simply pointed to the victims. The transition from the muddy, chaotic scene at Lake Conway to this pristine chamber of truth changed the energy of the investigation. It was no longer about a missing car or a submerged mystery. It was about the physical reality of pain. As the sheets were pulled back, the damage became undeniable. The water had washed away the dirt, but it couldn't hide the precision of the violence. Rivera stood at the foot of the table, his notepad ready, but his mind was already reeling from the level of calculation evident on the skin of the victims. These weren't the messy remains of a heat-of-the-moment altercation. This was the work of someone who had operated with a terrifying level of calm. Someone who had treated the lives of these two people as nothing more than a task to be completed. The room smelled of ozone and industrial cleaner, a scent that would forever be linked in Rivera's mind to the cold realization that he was hunting a predator who didn't make mistakes. The medical examiner leaned in, using a magnifying glass to highlight the deep, symmetrical furrows around John Thompson's wrists. These were not the marks of a struggle against a casual attacker. These were ligature marks, created by a rope that had been applied with professional knowledge of tension and restraint. The skin was bruised in a way that proved John was alive while he was bound. He had been forced into a state of total helplessness, his arms pulled back and secured with enough force to cut off the circulation, but not enough to break the bone. It was a cruel balance. The killer wanted him immobile, but he also wanted him conscious. Beside him, Vickie's wrists told the same story. This detail changed everything for Rivera. It meant the Thompsons hadn't been killed instantly at the scene of the abduction. They had been transported. They had spent their final minutes, perhaps hours, staring at their captor, feeling the rough texture of the rope against their skin, and realizing that their lives were being held in the hands of a monster. The geometry of the restraint suggested a level of training that went beyond the average criminal. The knots, though the rope was missing, had left impressions that indicated a specific style of securing a human being. It was a cold, clinical method of domination. John, a man who prided himself on being the protector of his home, had been stripped of his ability to move, forced to watch as his wife was subjected to the same terrifying fate. The marks were a silent testimony to the psychological torture they endured before the first shot was ever fired. When the examiner moved to Vickie's hands, the narrative of the crime became even more visceral. While John's marks suggested a man who had been quickly overpowered, Vickie's hands showed the raw, jagged evidence of a desperate fight. Her fingernails were torn to the quick, and there were deep vertical scratches along her forearms that didn't match the ligature marks.
These were defensive wounds. She had clawed at the air, at the seat of the car, and at the person who was trying to bind her. Under the microscope, the examiner found tiny flecks of dark material that weren't from the swamp. She had managed to grab onto something, or someone, before she was finally subdued. This wasn't a woman who went quietly into the night. Even in the face of a firearm and a superior physical force, Vickie Thompson had fought for her life with a ferocity that left her hands shattered. It was a heartbreaking realization for the investigators. Imagine the sheer terror of that moment in the back of the Ford Explorer, the air thick with fear, and the sound of your own heartbeat hammering in your ears as you realize there is no escape. Vickie had pushed back against the darkness until her very last breath. Her struggle was a testament to her spirit, but it was also a grim indicator of the killer's resolve. He hadn't been deterred by her resistance. He hadn't panicked. He had simply waited for her to tire, or perhaps he had used more force to silence her.
Every broken nail and every bruise on her knuckles was a piece of a story that ended in a tragedy so profound it left the seasoned detectives in the room struggling to maintain their professional distance. The ballistic evidence provided the final, lethal confirmation of the killer's expertise. Both John and Vickie had been executed with a single shot to the back of the head. The entry wounds were small, neat, and positioned with a terrifying understanding of human anatomy. The killer hadn't fired multiple times in a frenzy. He had fired twice. 2 shots, 2 lives ended. The .38 caliber bullets had been recovered from the interior of the vehicle, having passed through the victims and lodged into the heavy upholstery. There was no signs of hesitation, no shaking of the hand. The shots were fired from a distance of less than 6 inches, meaning the killer was close enough to feel the warmth of their skin as he pulled the trigger. The lack of gunpowder stippling on the outer clothing suggested that the weapon might have been muffled, or that the killer had used a specific technique to ensure a clean kill. This was the ballistic signature of someone who was comfortable with a firearm, someone who viewed the act of murder as a mechanical process. There was no wasted movement, no unnecessary cruelty beyond the act itself, just a cold, efficient deletion of 2 human beings. The bullets themselves were standard, the kind of ammunition that could be bought at any sporting goods store in Florida, making them almost impossible to track. The killer had left behind a scene that was a masterpiece of forensic avoidance. He had chosen a caliber that was common, a method that was quick, and a location that was hidden. He wasn't just a murderer, he was an executioner who understood exactly how to stay out of the reach of the law. As Rivera walked out of the medical examiner's office, the weight of the autopsy findings felt like a physical burden on his shoulders. The evidence pointed to a predator who was far more dangerous than a common mugger or a disgruntled associate. This was someone with the patience to scout a location, the skill to bind 2 adults without leaving a trace of a struggle in the house, and the coldness to execute them in the back of their own car. The professional nature of the crime was a dark cloud hanging over the entire investigation. It suggested a level of law enforcement or military background, someone who knew how to handle rope, how to handle a .38, and how to avoid leaving the kind of evidence that leads to an arrest. The killer had operated with a total lack of empathy, treating John and Vickie like obstacles to be removed, rather than people with families, dreams, and futures. It is a terrifying reality to face, that someone can walk among us, sharing our streets, and perhaps even our values, while harboring the capacity for such clinical violence. If you ever feel like you're truly safe just because you followed the rules, let this story be a warning. The Thompsons followed every rule, and they were still taken. The only way to survive a predator like this is to see the pattern before it completes itself. If you're not following this case to the end, you're leaving yourself in the dark. Rivera knew he wasn't just looking for a man, he was looking for a ghost who wore a human face. He vowed that day that the silence of the morgue wouldn't be the final word for John and Vickie. The investigation shifted from the cold steel of the morgue back to the warmth of the Thompson kitchen. Detective Rivera spent hours sifting through the remains of a life built on hope, looking for the one thread that had pulled them out of their sanctuary. On a small notepad kept near the wall-mounted telephone, he found it. In Vickie's neat, flowing script, there was an address scribbled in blue ink dated for that fateful Wednesday. Beside the address, she had written a time, 7 o'clock. Below that, a single word was underlined twice, potential. This wasn't just a location, it was the physical manifestation of a dream. Vickie had been telling everyone that her catering business was bursting at the seams. She needed space, industrial ovens, and a loading dock. She needed a place where her ambitions could finally breathe. To Rivera, this felt like a lifeline in a sea of dead ends. He could almost see Vickie standing at the counter, her face lit up with excitement as she took down the directions for what she believed was the next chapter of her success. She would have shared this news with John over a quick dinner, her energy making him smile despite his tired eyes. They would have dressed in their best casual clothes, wanting to make a good impression on the landlord or the agent they were supposed to meet. The note was a testament to their trust. They believed in the goodness of people and the rewards of hard work. They had no reason to suspect that the ink on that page was a death warrant.
Rivera tucked the note into an evidence bag, the small slip of paper feeling heavier than it looked. It was the bread and butter of a scam, the bait that had been used to hook two people who were simply looking for a way to grow. Rivera followed the directions on the note, driving south toward the developing area of Lake Nona. In 1999, this part of Orange County was a patchwork of orange groves and dirt roads, a place where the city began to lose its grip and the wilderness took over. As Rivera approached the coordinates Vickie had written, the paved road gave way to gravel. He checked his odometer, matching the distance exactly to her instructions. He pulled his cruiser to a stop in front of a flat, desolate patch of land. There was no commercial building. There was no industrial kitchen or loading dock. There was only an empty lot, overgrown with brown grass and guarded by a rusted wire fence. A scheduled for development sign stood crookedly in the center of the clearing, its paint peeling under the relentless sun. The realization hit Rivera like a physical blow. The destination was a lie. There was never a business opportunity. There was never a landlord waiting with a set of keys. This patch of dirt was nothing more than a stage, a quiet, isolated spot where a vehicle could be stopped without attracting attention. The killer had chosen a place that looked legitimate on a map, but offered total privacy for an ambush. Standing in the middle of that empty lot, Rivera could hear nothing but the wind whistling through the scrub brush and the distant drone of a cicada. It was a place designed for disappearance. He looked down at the tire tracks in the soft sand, but the recent afternoon rains had washed away any prints that might have remained. The Thompsons had driven to this exact spot with hearts full of hope, only to find themselves staring into the darkness of a trap that had been snapped shut the moment they put the car in park. This wasn't a generic lure. It was a bespoke trap, crafted with a surgical understanding of what the Thompsons wanted most in the world. To build a lie this convincing, the killer had to know about Vickie's catering struggles.
They had to know she was looking for a specific type of property in a specific price range. They had to know that John would want to accompany her to ensure the deal was sound. This level of detail suggested that the predator hadn't just been watching from the shadows. They had been listening. They might have been someone who sat at their table, someone who shared their barbecues, or someone who listened to their frustrations over a fence. The killer didn't just use force. They used psychological manipulation to bypass the Thompsons' natural defenses. By offering them exactly what they were praying for, the attacker ensured they would walk into the trap willingly, without their wallets, without their phones, and without a hint of suspicion. It was a masterpiece of deception. The person who wrote that address in Vickie's head was someone she trusted enough to follow into the middle of nowhere. It reveals a chilling level of cruelty, to take someone's greatest aspiration and turn it into the instrument of their destruction. Rivera began to realize that he wasn't looking for a stranger in a dark alley. He was looking for someone who occupied a space in the Thompsons' inner circle. The mystery box was no longer about where they went, but about who possessed the intimate keys to their lives. Who knew that Vickie was desperate for a new kitchen? Who knew they were planning a drive that Wednesday evening? The answer to those questions was the only way to unmask the ghost who had engineered this fatal detour. The architect of this deception had accounted for everything. By creating a fake business meeting, they ensured that the Thompsons would leave their house in a hurry, perhaps even leaving the garage door open in their excitement to be on time. They ensured that Tracy Mendoza would be waiting at the house, providing a distraction that delayed the reporting of the disappearance. The killer had managed to weaponize the couple's own virtues, their punctuality, their ambition, and their trust against them. Rivera sat in his car at the edge of the vacant lot, staring at the crooked development sign. He felt the weight of the betrayal. It is one thing to be a victim of a random crime, but it is another entirely to be led to your end by someone who knows your heart. This kind of calculated evil leaves a stain on a community that never truly washes away. It makes every neighbor look like a suspect and every friendly conversation feel like an interrogation. If you are watching this and feeling a sense of unease, you should. The Thompsons were not reckless people. They were smart, cautious, and loved, and yet they were led to this patch of dirt by a lie that was perfectly sized for their dreams. The danger isn't always a shadow in the bushes. Sometimes it's the person offering you exactly what you've been looking for. If you haven't subscribed to this investigation yet, you are leaving yourself open to the same blind spots that cost John and Vickie everything. Only by understanding the anatomy of a lie can you hope to survive one. Rivera turned the key in the ignition, the engine's roar breaking the heavy silence of the lot. He had a list of people to talk to, and he knew that somewhere on that list was a name that would eventually lead him to a killer who was hidden in plain sight. The investigation into the vacant lot led Detective Rivera straight to the wreckage of a broken friendship. In the quiet, orderly life of John Thompson, there was only one loud, jagged conflict that stood out like a fresh bruise. 6 months before the disappearance, John had finally walked away from a car restoration venture he had started with a man named Derek Holloway. It was supposed to be a dream project, taking rusted, forgotten muscle cars and breathing new life into them. But dreams have a way of turning into debts. Holloway was the opposite of John. Where John was methodical and patient, Holloway was impulsive and aggressive. He saw shortcuts where John saw safety. The partnership didn't just end, it imploded. Holloway was a man who felt the world owed him something, and he blamed John for the failure of the shop. He believed John's insistence on perfection had cost them time and money. When the doors finally closed, the friendship was replaced by a cold, simmering resentment. Rivera spent hours looking through the old business records, finding a trail of angry letters and late-night phone calls. Holloway wasn't just a former partner, he was a man who felt he had been robbed of his future. He had the motive, a deep personal grievance fueled by financial ruin. He knew John's habits, his love for cars, and his willingness to believe in a new business opportunity. To Rivera, Holloway looked like the perfect architect for a trap. He was a man with a grudge and the specific knowledge required to lure the Thompsons out of their home. Every lead in those first few days pointed toward this one man who seemed to have every reason to want John Thompson removed from the map. The resentment wasn't just emotional, it was legal and expensive. Derek Holloway had filed a lawsuit against John for $50,000, claiming a breach of contract that John's lawyers argued was entirely fabricated. In the weeks leading up to the murders, the legal battle had reached a boiling point. Court documents revealed that Holloway had been seen shouting at John in a local diner, his face red with a fury that made other patrons uncomfortable. He had lost his house, his shop, and his reputation, and in his mind, John Thompson was the one holding the bill. $50,000 is enough to make a desperate man do something unthinkable. It is enough to turn a civil dispute into a violent vendetta. Rivera noted that Holloway had been vocal about his hatred for John, telling anyone who would listen that John was going to pay for what he had done. This wasn't a secret grudge, it was a public declaration of war. The intensity of this financial pressure created a psychological profile of a man on the edge. Holloway was drowning in debt, and the Thompsons were living the life he felt he deserved. The contrast between his ruin and their success was a constant provocation. Rivera began to wonder if the commercial space lure was a direct mockery of the business they had lost together. It would be a cruel irony to lead a man to his death using the very dream that had already destroyed your friendship. The more Rivera dug into Holloway's finances, the more he saw a man who had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous person in any neighborhood. When Rivera finally sat across from Derek Holloway in the interrogation room, the tension was thick enough to feel. Holloway didn't look like a grieving friend, he looked like a cornered animal. He leaned back in the metal chair, his arms crossed tightly over a chest that heaved with every breath. When asked where he was on the night of July 14th, his answer was a flat, unhelpful shrug. He claimed he was home alone, watching television. No witnesses, no phone calls, no digital trail. In the age of alibis, being alone is a red flag that investigators cannot ignore. Rivera pressed him on the lawsuit, on the diner confrontation, and on his knowledge of John's routines. Holloway's responses were clipped and defensive. He didn't deny his hatred for John, but he denied the violence. He spoke about John with a vitriol that was chilling, calling him a snake who deserved to lose everything. but there was a gap between wanting someone ruined and wanting them dead. Rivera watched his hands. They were steady, but his eyes were darting toward the door. He was a man who knew he was the prime suspect and seemed almost proud of the attention. He didn't ask how Vickie was. He didn't ask if they had found the car. He only cared about how the investigation would affect his legal standing. This lack of empathy was a hallmark of the professional executioner Rivera had seen at the Morgan. He looked at Holloway's rough, calloused hands, hands that knew how to work with tools, hands that knew how to handle rope. The silence in the room was a battle of wills, and Holloway wasn't breaking. The pressure increased when Holloway agreed to a polygraph test. He seemed confident, almost arrogant, as the technician attached the sensors to his chest and fingertips. But the machine doesn't care about arrogance. As the question shifted from his background to the events of July 14th, the needles began to jump. When asked if he had seen the green Ford Explorer that Wednesday, the line spiked. When asked if he knew who killed the Thompsons, the results were even more erratic. He failed the test, not once, but twice. The physiological response was undeniable. His heart rate climbed, and his skin conductivity shifted every time John's name was mentioned in relation to the crime. To the public, a failed lie detector test is a smoking gun. To Rivera, it was a compass pointing north. He felt he was inches away from a confession. He authorized a search of Holloway's property, expecting to find the .38 revolver or the rope used to bind the victims. Forensic teams tore through his garage and his truck, looking for a single drop of blood or a stray fiber that would link him to the Lake Conway Nature Preserve. The community watched, convinced that justice was about to be served. The local news ran segments on the disgruntled partner, and for a moment it seemed the Thompson case would be solved within the month. The anger in the neighborhood was directed squarely at Holloway's front door. But as the hours turned into days, the confidence of the sheriff's office began to waver. The psychological profile was there, the motive was undeniable, and the failed polygraph was a heavy weight. But they were missing the one thing that holds a case together in court.
The frustration in the department reached a breaking point when the forensic results came back negative. Every tool in Holloway's shop was tested. Every inch of his truck was vacuumed. Nothing. No mud from the preserve, no gunpowder residue, no trace of the Thompsons' DNA. Despite his hatred, despite his lack of an alibi, and despite the failed polygraph, there was no physical bridge between Derek Holloway and the execution in the woods. Rivera sat at his desk, staring at the file until his eyes burned. He realized that a failed polygraph can be caused by many things: guilt over the lawsuit, general anxiety, or a deep-seated anger that has nothing to do with murder. Holloway was a man who hated John Thompson enough to fail a test, but he wasn't the man who pulled the trigger. The lead that had felt so solid, so certain, dissolved into a pile of circumstantial dust. It was a devastating blow to the investigation. The perfect villain had turned out to be a dead end. This left Rivera back at the beginning, staring at a list of names that suddenly felt much more threatening. If it wasn't the man who openly hated them, then it was someone who was much better at hiding their darkness. Someone who could kill with clinical precision and then walk back into their life without leaving a single mark. The realization was a cold reminder of the mystery box they were dealing with. The search for the killer wasn't over, it was just getting more difficult. Imagine the person who actually committed this crime watching the news, seeing Holloway take the heat, and smiling. If you think the most obvious suspect is always the guilty one, you are playing right into a killer's hands. Subscribe now to see how the real predator managed to stay in the shadows while the world looked the other way. With the collapse of the case against Holloway, the spotlight of the investigation turned toward a man whose anger had been physically carved into the Thompson home. Mitchell Garza was a contractor who had spent weeks inside the couple's private sanctuary, tearing down walls and rebuilding their kitchen. But what should have been a standard renovation had turned into a toxic battle of wills. John Thompson, ever the perfectionist, had identified a series of flaws in Garza's work, shoddy foundations and cut corners that didn't meet his rigorous standards.
He had fired Garza mid-project and refused to pay the final $3,000 of the contract. Neighbors later reported hearing shouting matches that spilled out onto the front lawn, with Garza pointing a finger at the house and promising that John would regret the day he questioned his craftsmanship. Garza was a man who lived on the edge of his temper, a heavy-set individual whose presence was as imposing as his resentment. He knew the layout of the house, he knew the security codes that John had shared in a moment of trust, he knew exactly which door to enter and which routine to exploit. To Rivera, this felt like a second chance at a breakthrough. Garza had the intimate access that a stranger lacked, and a volatile personality that could easily snap under the weight of a perceived insult. The contractor didn't just have a motive, he had the keys. He had walked the same floors as the victims, measured the very rooms where they ate their last meals, and held a grudge that was as fresh as the sawdust on his boots. The investigation hit a fever pitch when a search warrant for Garza's truck and workshop yielded a terrifying piece of evidence. Tucked inside a heavy metal toolbox, wrapped in a greasy rag, was a .38 caliber revolver. It was the exact same caliber used to end the lives of John and Vickie Thompson. The discovery sent a jolt of adrenaline through the sheriff's office. Rivera held the weapon in his gloved hand, feeling the cold weight of the steel and the dark possibility it represented. This wasn't just a lead, it was a physical link to the morgue. Garza's history of violence only added fuel to the fire. He had a record of bar fights and a reputation for using his tools as weapons when his temper flared. When questioned about the gun, Garza became combative, his face turning a deep shade of purple as he claimed he used it for protection on job sites. He couldn't provide a clear account of his whereabouts on the night of July 14th, claiming he was out driving to clear his head after another failed contract. To the detectives, it sounded like a confession in the making. They had the motive, the access, and now they had the potential murder weapon. The neighborhood of Thornhill Lakes held its breath, certain that the monster who had turned their world upside down was finally behind bars. The narrative felt complete. The disgruntled worker had returned to the house he had been kicked out of, used his knowledge of the couple to lure them into a trap, and silence them with the very gun he kept in his truck. The air in the ballistics lab was thick with anticipation as the lead technician prepared the test fire. Rivera watched through the observation glass, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the moment of truth. The technician fired Garza's revolver into a water tank, recovering the pristine lead slugs for comparison. Under a dual-lens microscope, the test bullets were placed side by side with the rounds recovered from the Ford Explorer. The room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the cooling fans and the scratch of Rivera's pen. The technician moved the slides back and forth, looking for the unique lands and grooves, the microscopic fingerprints that every gun barrel leaves on a bullet. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the technician stepped back and shook his head. It wasn't a match. The riffling marks were completely different. Garza's .38 was a common model, but it wasn't the one that had fired the fatal shots. The disappointment was a crushing weight. The physical evidence had once again refused to cooperate with the theory of the crime. Rivera felt a sense of vertigo. How could two perfect suspects, both with motives, both with access, and both with the right weapons, turn out to be nothing? It was as if the investigation was being mocked by a ghost who was always one step ahead. The revolver in the toolbox was just a gun, and Mitchell Garza, for all his rage and shoddy workmanship, was not a double murderer. The final blow to the Garza lead came when investigators discovered he had moved to Texas just 2 weeks after the murders. While it looked like a frantic escape, the paperwork proved he had accepted a job offer there months before the Thompsons were even targeted. He was leaving Florida to start over, not to hide. With his departure, the last active lead in the case evaporated. Rivera was standing in an empty evidence room, surrounded by files that led nowhere. The realization was terrifying. The killer wasn't a disgruntled worker or a frustrated contractor. The killer was someone who left no traces, someone who didn't shout in diners or leave guns in toolboxes. This was the birth of the ghost killer theory, the idea that they were hunting someone with a level of discipline that was almost superhuman. This person didn't act out of heat or passion. They acted with a cold, calculated intent that bypassed every traditional investigative net. The community's sense of safety, already fragile, completely shattered. If the police couldn't find the killer among the people who actually had reasons to hate the Thompsons, then the threat could be anyone. It could be the person delivering the mail, or the person sitting in the car next to you at a red light. The true predator was still out there, watching the investigation fail, perhaps even laughing at the futility of the law. As the case began to slide into the icy grip of the cold case files, Rivera knew that he wasn't just failing to find a man, he was failing to stop a ghost who had mastered the art of disappearance.
The December morning of the memorial service was uncharacteristically cold for Central Florida, a biting wind cutting through the black coats of the hundreds who gathered at the edge of Lake Conway. It had been 5 months since John and Vickie were taken, and the initial fire of the investigation had settled into a smoldering, painful ash. White balloons were released into a leaden sky, drifting upward until they were swallowed by the gray clouds, a silent prayer for a couple who had been the lifeblood of their community. But beneath the prayers, there was a growing, jagged edge of fear. The killer was still out there. Every person in the crowd looked at their neighbor with a new, poisoned perspective. The trust that had defined Thornhill Lakes was gone, replaced by deadbolts, security lights, and a heavy, suffocating silence. As the last notes of the service faded, the realization set in that there would be no quick resolution. The police had run out of names, out of tips, and out of hope. The flowers on the memorial eventually wilted and turned to brown husks, and the crowd dispersed, returning to homes that no longer felt like fortresses. The Thompsons' absence was a hole in the fabric of the neighborhood that refused to close. Their house, once filled with the scent of key lime pies and the sound of laughter, sat dark and stagnant, a reminder of a story that had been violently interrupted and left without an ending. Years began to bleed into one another with a cruel, relentless speed. The world moved on, as it always does, indifferent to the injustice that sat frozen in the archives of the sheriff's office. In Thornhill Lakes, the green Ford Explorer was eventually towed away, and new families moved into the houses on either side of the Thompson residence. Children who had played in the street when John and Vickie were alive grew up, graduated, and moved away, carrying the story of the submerged secret like a faded ghost story. The paint on the Thompson house peeled and was eventually refreshed by new owners who didn't know the names of the previous inhabitants. The local news stopped running anniversary segments, and the reward posters in the grocery store windows yellowed and curled until they were finally torn down to make room for advertisements for summer camps and lost pets. This is the true horror of a cold case, the slow, methodical erasure of a person's existence from the collective memory. While the world changed, while technology advanced and the landscape of Orlando shifted into a sprawling metropolis, the file on John and Vickie Thompson remained exactly the same. It was a snapshot of 1999, trapped in a cardboard box, waiting for a voice that would never come. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a physical weight that settled over the case, burying the truth under layers of time and indifference. Inside the headquarters of the Orange County Sheriff's Office, the Thompson file sat on a shelf in a room filled with thousands of other tragedies. Detective Rivera had promoted, moved to different units, and eventually seen his own hair turn gray, but the folder never truly left his mind. Every few years he would pull it down, his fingers tracing the frayed edges of the cardboard. He would look at the photos of the kitchen, the plastic-wrapped plates, the abandoned purse, and feel the same hollow ache in his chest that he felt that first night in July.
The ink on the forensic reports was beginning to fade, and the names on the witness list were becoming harder to track down. People died, people moved, and people forgot. The winter of silence had stretched from months into decades. It is a specific kind of torture for a detective to carry a failure for 20 years. It sits in the background of every other success, a reminder that somewhere a killer got away with the perfect crime. The file gathered dust, the physical evidence sat in climate-controlled lockers, and the ghost killer theory became an accepted, albeit frustrating legend in the department. The justice system, designed to be a machine of resolution, had stalled, leaving the Thompsons as nothing more than a statistic in a city that was too busy growing to look back at its scars. The most galling part of the silence was the reality of the killer's life. While John and Vickie were nothing more than bones in the dirt and ink on a page, their murderer was living. For 23 years, this person woke up, ate breakfast, and walked among us. They saw the same sunrises the Thompsons were denied. They perhaps raised families, celebrated holidays, and felt the warmth of the sun on their face, all while carrying the secret of 2 executions in the back of a Ford Explorer. This is the ultimate betrayal of the social contract, the idea that someone can commit an act of absolute evil and then simply blend back into the crowd, unpunished and unbothered. It is an injustice that should burn. Every day the killer remained free was a fresh insult to the memory of the couple who had given so much to their neighbors. We often tell ourselves that the truth will out, but the truth is often lazy. It requires someone to dig, to refuse to be silent, and to keep the fire burning when everyone else has turned away. If you feel the weight of this silence, if the idea of a predator living a normal life for 2 decades makes your blood boil, then you understand why these stories must be told. We are the keepers of the memory when the system fails. The winter was long, and the silence was deep, but time has a way of turning over stones that were meant to stay moved. The killer thought the clock had run out, but the most dangerous thing in the world is a secret that has been kept for too long. In 2019, 20 years after the silence began, the Thompson case was pulled from the darkness of cold storage. The world outside the evidence locker had transformed. The clunky computers of 1999 had been replaced by processing power that could map the human genome in hours. Detective Rivera's successors, a new generation of investigators armed with digital tools their predecessors couldn't have imagined, looked at the aging cardboard boxes not as a graveyard, but as a laboratory. They were no longer looking for a man, they were looking for a sequence. The decision to reopen the file wasn't sparked by a new tip or a dying confession. It was sparked by the relentless march of science. They knew that somewhere in those boxes, hidden among the yellowed reports and grainy photographs, was a microscopic witness that had been waiting for the world to catch up. The air in the cold case unit was thick with the scent of old paper and the hum of server racks. Every piece of evidence was laid out under high-intensity LED lights that revealed every imperfection. They were looking for the one thing the killer couldn't scrub away, the one thing that remains when memories fail and witnesses vanish. The investigators weren't interested in the obvious suspects anymore. They were looking for the invisible. They were looking for the biological footprint that a predator leaves behind when they think no one is watching. The awakening of the Thompson file was a declaration that the clock hadn't run out. It had simply been reset by a force more patient than time itself.
The breakthrough came from a single, overlooked trace of biological material found on a piece of discarded upholstery from the Ford Explorer. In 1999, this sample was too small, too degraded, and too complex to provide any answers. It was a microscopic smudge, a ghost in the fiber that had been dismissed as environmental contamination or simply unsuitable for testing. But 20 years of climate-controlled storage had acted as a time capsule. The forensic team focused on a specific area of the fabric where the killer would have exerted the most pressure while securing the ligatures. They were looking for touch DNA. the microscopic skin cells that are shed whenever a human hand makes contact with a surface. Under the lens of a powerful scanning electron microscope, the fibers of the seat appeared like a jagged mountain range, and trapped within those peaks were the remnants of a stranger. This was the microscopic witness. It didn't have a face, a voice, or a motive, but it carried a digital blueprint that was unique to only one person on the planet. The lab technicians used specialized vacuums and chemical washes to gently coax the cells from the fabric, treating each one as if it were a priceless diamond. There was no room for error. This was the final shot at justice, and if the sample was lost or contaminated, the secret of Lake Conway would be buried forever. The tension in the lab was palpable as the concentrated extract was moved into the amplification phase, the tiny droplet holding the weight of 2 decades of unanswered questions. The process of DNA amplification is a modern form of alchemy, taking a fragment of a person and turning it into a mountain of data. Inside the sterile confines of the forensic lab, the Thompson sample was placed into a thermal cycler. The machine began a rhythmic dance of heating and cooling, unzipping the double helix and duplicating the genetic code over and over until there was enough material to read. The scientists watched the monitors, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of the sequencing software. It was a high-stakes moment where biology met digital engineering. They were looking for the short tandem repeats, the specific markers that act as a genetic fingerprint. For hours, the software crunched the numbers, sorting through millions of base pairs to build a profile. The silence in the lab was clinical, broken only by the steady beep of the equipment. Slowly, a digital ladder began to form on the screen, a series of peaks and valleys that represented the predator's identity. It was a perfect profile. After 20 years of being a ghost killer, the perpetrator had finally been reduced to a string of numbers and letters. The microscopic witness had spoken, providing a code that the killer thought he had taken to his grave. This wasn't a guess or a theory, it was a biological certainty. The air in the room seemed to clear as the profile was finalized. They had the lock, now they just needed to find the key that would open the door to a name. With the genetic profile in hand, the investigators didn't just check the standard criminal databases, they entered the world of forensic genealogy. In 1999, the police were limited to CODIS, a database of known offenders. If the killer had never been arrested for a major crime, he remained invisible. But in 2019, the net was much wider. They uploaded the ghost killer's DNA to public genealogical sites, searching for distant relatives who had voluntarily shared their data to find their ancestors. It was a digital dragnet that spanned the globe. The software began to find matches, third cousins, great aunts, distant nephews. Each match was a breadcrumb leading back to a common ancestor. The investigators worked with specialized genealogists to build a massive family tree, pruning the branches until they were left with a single lineage that resided in Central Florida. The search was no longer about a car restoration partner or a disgruntled contractor. It was about a family tree that held a secret. The digital trail was cold and calculating, mirroring the crime itself. They tracked the movements of the men in that family, cross-referencing their ages and locations with the Thompson murders. The list of thousands narrowed down to hundreds, then dozens, and finally to a handful of brothers. The winter of silence was ending, replaced by the rapid clicking of keyboards and the realization that the killer had been hiding in the most mundane place of all, a family photo. The moment of revelation happened on a Tuesday morning, exactly 23 years after the bodies were found. The computer screen, which had been a wall of names and dates for months, suddenly blinked and settled on one individual. The family tree had narrowed to a single point. A name appeared in the center of the monitor, accompanied by a driver's license photo from the late 90s. The detectives leaned in, a collective breath held in the room. This was the shadow taking a shape.
The face staring back at them wasn't that of a known monster or a career criminal. He was an ordinary man with a steady job, a house, and a life that looked utterly unremarkable. He wasn't on the original list of suspects. He hadn't been interviewed by Rivera. He was a person who had vanished into the background of society, successfully evading the law for over 20 years. But the DNA was a perfect match. The mystery box had finally been opened, and what was inside was the most terrifying thing of all. The realization that the killer had been living a normal life just miles from where he had left John and Vickie in the dirt. The case had shifted from a mystery to a manhunt in a single heartbeat. The investigators felt a surge of adrenaline that washed away 20 years of fatigue. They had the name, they had the face. Now they just had to go and collect the man who thought he had gotten away with the perfect crime. The transition from a biological sample to a human name required a different kind of detective, one who operated in the digital code of heritage rather than the grit of the streets. Dr. Pamela Wu sat in a quiet office surrounded by monitors displaying the sprawling, interlaced branches of a massive family tree. She was a forensic genealogist, a specialist who viewed a DNA profile not as a static endpoint, but as a map of history. Using the GED match database, she began the hunt by identifying clusters of individuals who shared segments of the ghost killer's genetic material. In the beginning, the matches were frustratingly distant, third and fourth cousins scattered across the country who had no idea they shared blood with a double murderer. Dr. Wu worked backward, tracing these strangers to their common ancestors in the early 20th century, then moving forward again to find every living male descendant. It was a monumental task of data filtration. She spent weeks sifting through census records, marriage licenses, and high school yearbooks, building a digital bridge between the unknown and the known. Every leaf she added to the tree brought her closer to the center of the web. The process was a meticulous elimination of candidates who were the wrong age, who had passed away, or who had never stepped foot in Florida. In this environment, the sterile quiet was charged with the energy of an impending discovery. Dr. Wu wasn't just solving a crime, she was dismantling a shield of anonymity that had been fortified by 20 years of silence. She was the genetic architect, and she was building the cage that would finally hold a predator who had remained nameless for too long.
The thousands of potential relatives were eventually distilled into a single, localized lineage. Dr. Wu's screen began to highlight a specific cluster of siblings who had lived in the Orlando area during the late 90s. This was the moment where the abstract science of genealogy collided with the concrete reality of a homicide investigation. She began to overlay the family's movements with the timeline of the Thompson disappearance. One branch of the tree stood out, a family of 3 brothers. 2 of them had clear, documented histories that placed them elsewhere, but the 3rd brother was a void in the record. As she cross-referenced the genetic markers with public records, the software began to narrow the probability. The distant cousins she had identified weeks earlier with a key. Their shared DNA acted like a triangulation system, pointing directly to a specific set of parents. The air in the room felt thin as the computer processed the final link. Dr. Wu wasn't looking at a stranger anymore. She was looking at a specific household. This was the sifting of the cousins, a process that stripped away the camouflage of a normal life. Every click of her mouse was a step closer to the person who had pulled the trigger in the back of that green Ford Explorer. The biological data was undeniable, a mathematical certainty that could not be argued or ignored. The ghost killer was no longer a phantom. He was a person with a birth date, a social security number, and a place in a family that had no idea what he had done. The silence of the office was broken by the sharp, rhythmic tapping of keys as the final search query was executed. On the center monitor, the genealogical software finished its calculation and displayed a single name in bold text: Bradley Pearson. The moment the name appeared, the energy in the room shifted from clinical observation to a visceral shock. Detective Rivera's successors, who were standing behind Dr. Wu, leaned in, their eyes scanning the biographical data that flooded the screen. Bradley Pearson. He wasn't a ghost. He was a man who had lived within the very community he had terrorized. As they pulled up his driver's license photo from 1999, they saw a face that was hauntingly ordinary, a square jaw, a neutral expression, and eyes that revealed nothing of the darkness beneath. But the real shock came when they looked at his employment history during the time of the murders. Pearson wasn't just a neighbor or a local worker. He was a man who understood the inner workings of the law. The revelation hit the investigators with the force of a physical blow. The reason the crime had been so clean, the reason the ballistics were so precise, and the reason no evidence had been left behind was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. They weren't just looking at a killer. They were looking at a man who had been trained to think like the people hunting him. The name Bradley Pearson represented the ultimate betrayal of the trust the Thompsons had placed in their world. He was the wolf who had worn the skin of the shepherd. The discovery of Bradley Pearson's background as a former law enforcement officer sent a cold shiver through the entire department. He had served in a nearby jurisdiction, a detail that explained the clinical nature of the professional execution style that had haunted Rivera for decades. Pearson knew how to handle a .38 caliber revolver without leaving gunpowder residue on his own clothing. He knew how to bind a human being with ligatures that maximized control and minimized noise. Most importantly, he knew how the police would investigate the disappearance. He had used his training to engineer a crime that avoided every common pitfall. He knew about the 48-hour window. He knew how to avoid leaving touch DNA before the term was even common, and he knew how to stay calm under the pressure of a citywide search. This was the ultimate betrayal of the oath he had taken to protect and serve. He had used the skills provided to him by the state to delete 2 innocent lives for reasons that were still hidden in the shadows of his own mind. The family tree of terror had led the investigators to a mirror. They were looking at one of their own, a man who had turned the tools of justice into the instruments of a cold-blooded ambush. The search for the killer was over, but the search for the truth was just beginning. How many other secrets had he kept while wearing a badge? How many other victims had he watched from the safety of his position? The name Bradley Pearson was a stain on the memory of every officer who had worked the case, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who knows exactly how to hide in plain sight. The badge that should have represented safety was in reality a skeleton key that granted Bradley Pearson access to the most private corners of the Thompsons' lives. He didn't need to break windows or pick locks. He operated with the quiet authority of a man who belonged behind the yellow tape. In the months leading up to the disappearance, Pearson had utilized his position to build a profile of John and Vickie that was far more intimate than any common stalker could achieve. He understood the rhythm of their street and the vulnerabilities of their routine. While John was busy perfecting his home and Vickie was growing her business, Pearson was watching from the periphery, sometimes even pulling his patrol car into their neighborhood under the guise of a routine check. He had used the departmental databases to run their plates and look into their financial records, treating their personal information as a tactical advantage. This was the true horror of the wolf in the fold. The very system the Thompsons trusted to protect them was being used to map out their destruction. Pearson saw their success not as something to be admired, but as a target to be exploited. He knew when they left for work, when they returned, and exactly how much they had to lose. His badge allowed him to linger in places where anyone else would have been questioned, turning him into an invisible threat that walked in broad daylight. He wasn't just a predator. He was a predator who had been given the keys to the kingdom, and he used every ounce of that power to ensure that when he finally moved, there would be no way for his victims to see him coming.
The roots of the tragedy reached back a year prior to the murders, to a 1998 burglary at the Thompson residence that never sat right with John. At the time, several valuable items were taken, but there were no signs of forced entry. The investigation had gone cold almost immediately, but John, with his meticulous nature, had noticed a detail that chilled him. The thief seemed to know exactly where the most valuable items were hidden. He began to suspect that the intruder wasn't a stranger, but someone who had been inside the house with a reason to be there. He shared his concerns with local officers, unaware that the man who had responded to the initial call was the very person who had orchestrated the theft. Bradley Pearson had stood in the Thompsons' living room, taking a statement and offering comfort, all while mentally cataloging the items he would later return to steal. When John started asking too many questions about the lack of progress in the burglary case, Pearson realized that his double life was in jeopardy. The burglary hadn't just been about greed, it had been the first crack in the foundation of the Thompsons' security. John's refusal to let the matter go transformed him from a victim into a threat. Pearson didn't just want the jewelry and the cash, he wanted to silence the man who was beginning to look too closely at the shadow behind the badge. The 1998 break-in was the prologue to the 1999 execution, a test run for a killer who was learning exactly how much he could get away with before the world started to take notice.
The tension reached a breaking point when John Thompson took a step that Pearson could not ignore. He began making quiet inquiries to internal affairs. John had noticed inconsistencies in the reports filed regarding the burglary, and his search for the truth led him to the doorstep of Pearson's own department. A secret dossier began to form, not within the sheriff's office, but in John's own study. He was documenting every time a patrol car lingered too long in front of his house, and every time he felt he was being followed. He didn't know the name Bradley Pearson yet, but he knew the silhouette of the man who was haunting him. Pearson, through his own connections within the department, caught wind of the inquiries. He knew that if John continued to pull at the thread, the entire tapestry of his career and his freedom would unravel. The motive for the murders wasn't just a grudge or a financial dispute. It was a desperate act of self-preservation by a man who had everything to lose. Pearson saw himself as a soldier in a war of his own making, and the Thompsons were the enemy combatants who had discovered his position. He couldn't risk a formal investigation into his conduct, so he decided to conduct an investigation of his own, one that would end in a permanent silence. The internal affairs inquiries were the catalyst that moved Pearson from petty theft to cold-blooded homicide. He realized that as long as John and Vickie were alive, they were a ticking time bomb that threatened to destroy the life he had built behind the safety of his uniform. In the final weeks, Pearson's surveillance became an obsession. He would sit in the darkness of the Lake Conway Nature Preserve, imagining the moment he would bring them there. He dramatized the hunt in his mind, viewing the Thompsons not as people, but as obstacles to be cleared. Using his department-issued gear, he tracked their movements with a chilling efficiency. He was a hunter who knew his prey's every habit. He watched Vickie in the kitchen, the very kitchen where she would later wrap those plates in plastic, unaware that the eyes of her killer were fixed on her from the shadows of the tree line. Pearson used his badge as a shield. If a fellow officer had spotted him, he would have simply claimed he was conducting a stakeout. This was the ultimate exploitation of his role. He was using the resources of the state to facilitate a private execution. He saw the excitement in Vickie's face when she spoke about the new commercial space, and he realized that her dream was the perfect lure. He crafted the fake address and the fake meeting with the same attention to detail he used in his police reports. He knew that the promise of success would override their natural caution.
He watched them leave the house that final Wednesday, perhaps even feeling a sense of professional pride in how perfectly his trap had been set. He was the hunter who had convinced the deer to walk straight into the clearing, and as he followed them toward Lake Nona, he knew that the silence he was about to create would protect him for a lifetime. The tragedy of the Thompson case lies in the misplaced trust they had in the institutions meant to protect them. They lived their lives with the belief that the law was a barrier between them and the darkness, never realizing that the darkness had put on a uniform. John's bravery in reaching out to internal affairs was the very thing that sealed his fate. He was a good man trying to do the right thing, and he was murdered by the person he expected to uphold the truth. It is a haunting reflection on the nature of power and the vulnerability of the innocent. When we look back at the 1999 memorial, we see a community mourning a loss they didn't fully understand. They were mourning a mystery, while the answer was standing among them, perhaps even wearing a black band over his badge in a mock display of grief. If you are hearing this and feeling a profound sense of injustice, you are right to feel that way. The system failed John and Vickie at every turn, not because it was broken, but because it was hijacked by a wolf who knew the fold better than the sheep did. Every day that Pearson remained free was an indictment of the world they lived in. If you aren't supporting the efforts to bring these shadows to light, you are allowing the silence to win. The truth was hidden behind a badge for 23 years, but the blood in the fibers of that Ford Explorer eventually found its voice. Pearson thought he had deleted the Thompsons from the world, but he forgot that the truth doesn't require a badge to be heard. It only requires someone with the courage to keep looking until the wolf is finally unmasked. The silence that had protected Bradley Pearson for 23 years was finally shattered on a humid morning in 2022. He was no longer the fit, tactical officer of the late 90s. He was a man in his 50s, living a quiet life that he believed was untraceable. When the tactical team swarmed his residence, the neighborhood watched in stunned confusion as a man they knew as a neighbor was forced onto the pavement. There was no grand shootout and no dramatic chase. Pearson's reaction was one of a man who had been expecting this knock for 2 decades, but had eventually convinced himself it would never come. As the steel cuffs ratcheted shut around his wrists, the physical weight of his past finally caught up to him. He didn't ask what this was about. He didn't proclaim his innocence with the fervor of a wrongly accused man. He simply went cold, a mask of indifference settling over his features that mirrored the clinical nature of his crimes. The arrest was the culmination of thousands of hours of genealogical research and forensic persistence. It was the moment the ghost killer was forced into the light of the modern world. For the first time since 1999, the power dynamic had shifted. The man who had used the law as a weapon was now being dismantled by it. As he was led away, the investigators felt a sense of profound relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge of how long he had walked free. The shadow that had hung over Lake Conway was beginning to lift, replaced by the harsh, uncompromising glare of a justice system that had refused to forget the names John and Vickie Thompson. The courtroom in 2022 was a theater of long-delayed reckoning. Bradley Pearson sat at the defense table, stripped of his authority and his anonymity, facing the family members whose lives he had fractured over 2 decades prior. The DNA evidence was the centerpiece of the prosecution, a biological testimony that Pearson's lawyers could not explain away. But the most powerful moment came when Nathan Brooks stood to deliver his victim impact statement. Nathan, once the small boy who had lost his grandparents in a single night of violence, was now a grown man. He spoke with a voice that was steady but thick with the weight of 23 years of unanswered questions. He described the holidays spent with empty chairs and the constant gnawing fear that the killer was still out there, watching them. He looked directly at Pearson, demanding to know how a man who wore a badge could justify such a betrayal. The air in the courtroom was heavy with the collective grief of a community that had been holding its breath for a generation. Pearson remained stoic, but the mountain of evidence, the cell tower data, the genealogical links, and the microscopic traces of his own skin found in the Thompsons' vehicle was insurmountable. The jury's verdict of guilty was not just a legal conclusion, it was a restoration of the truth. The man who thought he had committed the perfect crime was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his days in a cell, finally as helpless as the couple he had bound and executed. Outside the courthouse, a small group gathered once more to release white balloons into the Florida sky. It was a mirroring of the 1999 service, but this time the atmosphere was different. The balloons didn't disappear into a gray void of uncertainty. They rose into a clear, bright horizon, a symbol of a burden finally laid to rest. The closure was real, but it was haunted by the length of time it took to arrive. John and Vickie Thompson finally had their justice, yet the cost of that justice was 23 years of stolen life for their families and 23 years of unearned freedom for their killer. It serves as a chilling reminder of the fragility of our security. We move through our days believing in the integrity of the people around us, trusting that the uniforms and the badges represent a shield against the darkness. But the Thompson case proves that sometimes the most dangerous ghost is the one sitting in the car next to you or the one responding to your call for help. The nature of trust is such that once it is shattered, the world never looks quite the same. We must remain vigilant, not out of paranoia, but out of a respect for the truth that John and Vickie were denied for so long. As the final balloon faded from view, the silence of the woods at Lake Conway felt different, no longer a secret, but a memory. The ghosts of the past have been named, and the darkness has been forced to retreat, leaving us with the heavy realization that while justice may be slow, it possesses a memory that time can never truly erase.